You're joking, right? Gary Petrov stared at the contract floating before him, its golden runes shifting and reforming as if alive. 500 years as a caretaker? The recruitment agent? A being composed entirely of what appeared to be condensed starlight, pulsed with mild irritation. The timeline is negotiable. We can discuss early termination after the 1st century. Gary ran a hand through his disheveled brown hair. At 32, he'd spent the last decade as an inner-city delivery driver, navigating the chaotic streets of New New York. His cramped apartment in the 12th tower wasn't much, but it was home, even if the rent kept climbing. The building's claim to fame was the mysterious top floors, which urban legends claimed housed cosmic maintenance equipment. Those legends, as it turned out, weren't far off. And all I have to do is feed dragons? Cosmic dragons, the agent corrected, its voice resonating directly in Gary's mind. 3 of them. And yes, feeding is the primary duty. The Dragon Care Manual covers everything else. Gary glanced at the leather-bound tome that had materialized on his kitchen table. It was surprisingly thin for something that apparently contained instructions for caring for universe-altering entities. Why me? The starlight being flickered, which Gary interpreted as the equivalent of a shrug. Your application was selected from the pool of eligible candidates.
I never applied for...
You did. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. You were inebriated at the time, but consent given under the influence of alcohol remains binding under Intergalactic Labor Code 7291, subsection Q. Gary vaguely remembered a strange app he'd downloaded during a particularly lonely night after a bad breakup. He'd thought it was a dating service for exotic pet enthusiasts. He sighed. His current job barely covered rent and food for himself and Maurice, his somewhat judgmental pet lizard. The compensation package outlined in glowing script at the bottom of the contract included immortality for duration of service and pension indexed to cosmic inflation. Fine, he said, pressing his thumb against the contract. Where do I sign? You just did, the being replied, the contract dissolving into golden particles that sank into Gary's skin. Orientation begins tomorrow. The elevator in your building will now grant access to the Dragon Keep. Good day, Caretaker Petrov. With that, the being collapsed in on itself and vanished, leaving behind only a faint smell of ozone and cinnamon. Maurice, who had been watching the entire exchange from his terrarium, flicked his tongue disapprovingly. Don't look at me like that, Gary muttered. At least we won't have to worry about rent anymore. Little did he know that his new job description, Feed the Dragons, would prove to be far more complex, consequential, and reality-altering than 3 simple words could possibly convey. The elevator in Gary's building had always been unreliable. It creaked, stalled, and occasionally dropped a floor before catching itself. Today, however, it hummed with an energy that made the hairs on Gary's arms stand on end. When he pressed the button for his floor, the 7th, a new panel slid open, revealing a series of symbols that definitely hadn't been there the day before. After a moment's hesitation, Gary pressed the symbol that looked most like a dragon. The elevator lurched upward with unexpected speed, causing his stomach to drop. The numbers above the door stopped at 12, then continued, 13, 14, 15, all the way to 42, before the display shifted to show symbols instead of numbers. When the doors finally opened, Gary stepped out into what could only be described as impossibility. The Dragon Keep defied all laws of architecture and physics. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, supported by columns of swirling energy rather than any physical material. The floor beneath his feet was transparent in places, revealing stars and galaxies moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Windows that should have shown the new New York skyline instead displayed different planets, some with multiple suns, others wreathed in colorful nebulae. Welcome, Caretaker Petrov. A voice echoed through the vast space. It belonged to a humanoid figure with pale blue skin and eyes that contained miniature constellations. I am Ambassador Zeta, representative of the High Council of Improbable Events. I will be overseeing your orientation. Gary swallowed nervously. Nice to meet you. I brought my manual. He held up the leather-bound book the Starlight being had left. Zeta nodded approvingly. Excellent. The manual contains all standard protocols for dragon maintenance. However, the most important rule is quite simple. Feed the dragons. Everything else is merely details. Right. Feed the dragons. Got it. Gary tried to sound confident. When do I meet them? Now. Zeta gestured toward 3 massive doors at the far end of the hall, each one at least 30 feet tall and made of different materials. The left door appeared to be carved from a single piece of azure crystal. The middle one forged from some kind of shifting, flame-like metal. And the right one seemed to be made of nothing at all, a door-shaped absence in reality itself. These are the containment chambers for Azurite, Emberscale, and Voidfang, Zeta explained. Each dragon requires specific environmental conditions and, most importantly, specific nutritional elements. What do they eat? Gary asked, dreading the answer. His mind conjured images of having to feed them live animals, or worse, people. Memories, Zeta replied simply. Gary blinked. Come again? The dragons consume memories, not your personal memories. Of course, that would be inefficient. The kitchen synthesizes memory-rich nutrient solutions based on templates in the system. Zeta led Gary to an adjoining room that resembled a cross between an industrial kitchen and a laboratory from a science fiction film. This is where you will prepare their meals. Gary stared at the equipment. Vats of swirling energy, containers labeled in scripts he couldn't read, and utensils that changed shape depending on the angle from which he viewed them. I don't know how to cook, whatever this is. The manual contains recipes. Begin with the basics, single timeline memory infusions, before attempting anything more complex. Zeta handed Gary what looked like a chef's apron, though it was made of a material that felt simultaneously like silk and metal. The standard of grace is clear. Feed the dragons. The manner in which you fulfill this directive is flexible, within parameters. What exactly are these dragons doing here? Gary finally asked the question that had been nagging at him since he signed the contract. Why are they kept in containment? Why do they need to be fed memories? Zeta's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in those cosmos-filled eyes. The dragons maintain reality. Caretaker Petrov. Their presence, properly managed and balanced, stabilizes the fabric of existence across all timelines and dimensional planes. They convert memory energy into the coherent probability fields that prevent reality from dissolving into chaos. So, they're like cosmic maintenance equipment? A crude but not entirely inaccurate analogy, Zeta conceded. Now, your first feeding is scheduled in 3 hours. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the manual before then. With that, the ambassador vanished in a subtle ripple of space-time, leaving Gary alone in the kitchen with his manual and an increasing sense that he was utterly unprepared for this job. Feed the dragons, he muttered to himself, opening the manual to the first page. How hard can it be? The manual, as it turned out, was deceptively complex. Despite its thin appearance, the pages seemed to multiply whenever Gary turned them, revealing diagrams, incantations, warnings, and recipes that made his head spin. After 2 hours of reading, he'd barely scratched the surface, but had grasped the essentials of dragon feeding. Each dragon required a different type of memory-infused sustenance. Azurite consumed memories of the past, historical events, ancient knowledge, forgotten skills. Emberscale required memories of the present, current experiences, immediate sensations, Ongoing thoughts. Voidfang needed something called future potentials, possibilities that had not yet occurred, but might still come to pass. The kitchen contained everything needed to synthesize these memory meals. The process involved selecting base ingredients, infusing them with the appropriate temporal energies, and then presenting them in the correct sequence to each dragon. Gary checked the time. Only 30 minutes until the first feeding. He decided to start with the simplest recipe, a historical memory stew for Azurite. Following the manual's instructions, he selected a base matrix, a shimmering blue liquid that the system identified as primordial recollection medium, and set it to simmer in a cauldron that hovered above an energy field rather than a flame. Next, he accessed the memory archives through a crystal interface, selecting medieval European craftsmanship, 13th century blacksmithing, as the primary flavor component. The memories materialized as golden motes of light that he carefully folded into the simmering medium. As they dissolved, the mixture began to take on images, briefly showing hammer strikes on glowing metal, bellows pumping air into forge fires, and the weathered hands of masters crafting armor and tools. "Not bad for a first attempt," Gary murmured, though he had no real frame of reference. The manual suggested adding a personal touch to enhance the meal, but offered no specifics on what that might entail. After a moment's hesitation, Gary reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal token, a souvenir coin from a Renaissance fair he'd attended as a child. He'd carried it as a good luck charm ever since. On impulse, he dipped it briefly into the mixture, allowing the memory stew to absorb the faint impressions of his own experiences with the coin. The mixture shimmered, then settled into a deep, rich blue that seemed to contain countless tiny stars. As he was preparing to ladle the stew into a serving vessel, Gary noticed a small container on a nearby shelf, labeled Future Fragmentations, Caution, Unstable. Curious, and perhaps a bit reckless from the overwhelming nature of his first day, he opened it and peered inside. The container held what looked like shards of glass that weren't quite there, flickering in and out of existence, each showing brief glimpses of events that had never happened. One caught his eye, a fragment showing what appeared to be himself, but older, standing before the dragons with a confidence he certainly didn't feel now. Before he could reconsider, Gary plucked this fragment and dropped it into Azurite stew. The mixture swirled violently for a moment, taking on an opalescent quality that definitely wasn't mentioned in the manual, before settling again. "Hope you like surprises," Gary muttered, transferring the stew to a hovering serving platform, as indicated in the manual. He repeated the process for the other two dragons, following recipes for present perception porridge and potential possibility puree, though he refrained from adding any unorthodox ingredients to these preparations. When all three meals were ready, Gary took a deep breath and approached the first of the three massive doors, the crystal one containing Azurite. The door recognized his presence as caretaker and swung open silently, revealing a chamber that seemed to contain an entire ocean, suspended in air. Schools of what might have been fish, but could equally have been stars, swam through currents of liquid light. And there, in the center of this impossible aquatic cosmos, coiled around what appeared to be the physical manifestation of time itself, was Azurite. The dragon was enormous, at least 100 feet from snout to tail tip, with scales that shifted between every shade of blue imaginable. Its eyes, when they turned toward Gary, contained entire histories, civilizations rising and falling in the blink of a cosmic eyelid. Gary stood frozen, the serving platform hovering beside him, as the dragon unfurled itself and drifted closer. Its movement created ripples through the fabric of the chamber, distorting space-time in hypnotic patterns. "I brought your lunch," Gary managed, his voice barely a whisper. Azurite made no sound, but Gary felt a presence brush against his mind, curious, ancient, and surprisingly gentle. The dragon extended its massive head toward the serving platform, examining the stew with what Gary could only interpret as interest. Then, with a motion like a wave breaking on a distant shore, Azurite consumed the meal. The stew didn't simply disappear into a mouth. Rather, it was absorbed directly into the dragon's being, the memory-infused mixture becoming part of Azurite's very essence. What happened next was definitely not in the manual. Azurite's scales flared with brilliant light, and the dragon's presence in Gary's mind intensified. Suddenly, he wasn't just standing in the chamber. He was experiencing memories that weren't his own. He saw himself through Azurite's perception, but older, more confident, serving meals that defied description, meals that seemed to alter reality itself. He saw the chains that bound Azurite to this chamber weakening, not breaking but evolving. He saw patterns of probability shifting, realigning, creating new pathways through existence. As abruptly as it began, the vision ended. Gary found himself on his knees, gasping for breath, as Azurite drifted back to its position around the temporal anchor at the center of the chamber. What was that?" Gary whispered. There was no answer, but he felt a sense of expectation from the dragon, as if Azurite had just shown him something important and was waiting to see what he would do with the information. Shaken, Gary retreated from the chamber, the crystal door closing silently behind him. He still had 2 more dragons to feed, and he was already off script from anything the manual had prepared him for. "Feed the dragons," he muttered to himself as he approached Emberscale's fiery door. Nobody mentioned mind-melding visions of the future. The encounters with Emberscale and Voidfang proved equally disorienting, though in different ways. Emberscale's chamber was a maelstrom of fire and energy, with the dragon itself a serpentine creature of living flame. When it consumed its meal, Gary was bombarded with the immediate present, experiencing every moment in perfect, overwhelming detail. Each heartbeat, breath, thought, and quantum fluctuation happening simultaneously across countless planes of existence. Voidfang's chamber was the most disturbing, a vast emptiness that somehow contained everything. The dragon was barely visible, a shape defined by the absence of reality rather than any physical form. Its consumption of the possibility puree left Gary with a profound sense of what might be, an almost unbearable weight of potential futures branching out from this moment into infinity. By the time he completed the feeding and returned to the kitchen, Gary was drenched in sweat and trembling from experiences his human mind was never designed to process. First feedings are always impactful. Ambassador Zeta's voice startled him. The representative had reappeared, watching Gary with those cosmic eyes. "Though your reaction suggests something unusual occurred." Gary hesitated, unsure whether to mention the visions or his impulsive addition to Azurite's meal. "The dragons are more than I expected," he said carefully. "Indeed, they are foundational entities. Caretaker Petrov. Their existence predates the current configuration of reality." Zeta moved closer, examining Gary with unnerving intensity. "The High Council monitors all interactions with the dragons closely. Any deviations from standard protocols would be noted and investigated thoroughly." The warning was clear, if subtle. Gary nodded, trying to appear appropriately respectful. "I'm still learning the ropes. I'll stick to the manual moving forward." Zeta seemed satisfied with this response. "Very good. You will be responsible for 3 feedings per day, measured in local Earth time. The manual contains schedules and recipes for various nutritional requirements. Should you have questions, consult the manual first. I will return periodically to assess your performance." With that, the ambassador vanished again, leaving Gary alone with his thoughts and the lingering sensations from his encounters with the dragons. "Maurice is not going to believe this," he murmured, heading back to the elevator. As the doors closed and the cab began its descent to his apartment, Gary couldn't shake the image of himself from Azurite's vision. Confident, purposeful, changing reality itself through the simple act of feeding dragons.
What exactly had he gotten himself into?
When Gary returned to his apartment, Maurice was perched on the edge of his terrarium, head tilted at an angle that somehow managed to convey both curiosity and judgment. "You wouldn't believe the day I've had," Gary told the lizard as he collapsed onto his worn sofa. "I fed cosmic dragons memories and had visions of the future, or possible futures. I think I might have messed up the space-time continuum on my first day." Maurice blinked slowly, his expression unchanging. "You're right," Gary sighed. "I should probably be more careful tomorrow." He reached for the manual, which had accompanied him back to his apartment, intending to study it more thoroughly before the next feeding. As he opened it, he was surprised to find new sections had appeared, detailed notes on the dragon's reactions to different memory combinations, warnings about temporal contamination, and a chapter titled Advanced Culinary Reality Manipulation that definitely hadn't been there earlier. The book is updating itself, Gary realized, flipping through pages that seemed to respond to his thoughts and experiences. That's convenient, I guess. He spent the next few hours reading, trying to make sense of concepts that stretched the limits of human comprehension. According to the manual, the dragons didn't just maintain reality, they continuously rebuilt it, moment by moment. Their consumption and processing of memories, creating the coherent timeline that beings across the multiverse experienced as reality. The chains that bound them in their chambers weren't prison restraints, but stabilizing mechanisms, ensuring that their reality-shaping powers remained in balance. Too much influence from any one dragon would distort existence toward either the past, Azurite, the present, Ember Scale, or the potential futures, Void Fang. Most intriguing was a passage that appeared just as Gary was about to drift off to sleep. The Standard of Grace, Feed the Dragons, contains within it the seeds of both perfect stability and perfect evolution. The caretaker's interpretation of this directive shapes not only the dragon's nutrition, but the very nature of reality itself. Choose wisely. Gary fell asleep with the manual open on his chest, dreaming of dragons swimming through oceans of time and himself, stirring pots of liquid possibility with a spoon made from his own memories. The next morning, Gary awoke with a clarity of purpose that surprised him. The visions from the dragons, especially Azurite's glimpse of his future self, had lodged in his mind and begun to germinate ideas. "The manual says I need to interpret the directive," he told Maurice as he prepared for his day. "That means there's room for creativity, right?" Maurice, who had moved to the windowsill to bask in the morning sunlight, flicked his tail in what Gary chose to interpret as encouragement. "Exactly. I'm going to try something different today." When Gary arrived at the Dragon Keep, he spent extra time in the kitchen, experimenting with combinations not explicitly outlined in the manual. For Azurite, he prepared a historical paradox bisque that combined memories of contradictory historical accounts of the same events. For Emberscale, he crafted a multi-perspective present paella that incorporated simultaneous experiences of the same moment from different conscious beings. And for Voidfang, he attempted a probability wave soufflé that balanced highly likely futures with nearly impossible ones. Each preparation was more complex than anything he'd attempted before, but something in the dragon's reactions yesterday had convinced him that they craved more than the basic recipes provided in the manual. As he worked, Gary noticed subtle changes in the kitchen itself. Utensils seemed to anticipate his needs. Ingredients appeared within reach, just as he thought of them, and the energy fields powering the various appliances hummed in harmony with his own movements. When he entered Azurite's chamber with the Paradox Bisque, the dragon was already waiting, its massive form undulating with what Gary could only interpret as eagerness. The moment Azurite consumed the meal, the connection between them reopened. But this time, Gary was prepared for it. Rather than being overwhelmed by the vision, he engaged with it, mentally asking questions about what he was seeing. The images shifted in response, showing him how historical contradictions created flexibility in the timeline, allowing for adaptation and evolution rather than rigid determinism. Similar experiences followed with Emberscale and Voidfang, each dragon seemingly pleased with the more complex offerings and willing to share insights into their functions in maintaining, and now, Gary realized, evolving reality. Over the days that followed, Gary grew increasingly bold with his culinary experiments. He discovered that adding his own memories to the mixtures strengthened his connection with the dragons, allowing for clearer communication through the visions they shared. He learned that certain combinations could alter the flow of probability in specific ways, creating ripples of change that spread outward through the multiverse. Most importantly, he began to understand the true nature of his role as caretaker. The standard of grace, feed the dragons, wasn't just about providing sustenance. It was about facilitating a controlled evolution of reality itself. One morning, about 2 weeks into his new job, Gary was surprised to find Maurice sitting on his kitchen counter when he woke up, the lizard's eyes fixed on him with unusual intensity. "Something wrong, buddy?" Gary asked, reaching for the coffee maker. "They're watching you more closely now," Maurice replied. Gary nearly dropped his coffee mug. "You can talk?" "I've always been able to talk," Maurice said, his voice a surprisingly dignified tenor that somehow fit his reptilian appearance perfectly. "I simply had no reason to reveal this ability until now." Gary stared at his pet in disbelief. "Why now? And what do you mean they're watching me?" "The High Council has noticed the changes in the reality maintenance patterns. Ambassador Zeta has been instructed to investigate potential protocol violations." Maurice flicked his tongue thoughtfully. "I am what you might call a contingency measure, placed with potential caretakers to provide guidance if needed." "You're, what, a spy, an advisor?" "A friend," Maurice corrected, "with certain additional capabilities. I can help you communicate with the dragons more effectively. Their language is closer to my species than to yours." Gary sat down heavily. "So my pet lizard is actually some kind of cosmic translator who's been watching me for how long?" "Since you adopted me 3 years ago, and I prefer the term companion to pet," Maurice said with what might have been a reptilian smile. "Now, about your feeding techniques. They're quite innovative. The dragons are responding well, but the Council is concerned about the accelerating evolution rate." "Is that bad?" "It depends on one's perspective. The Council prefers stability and predictability. The dragons, however, were not designed merely to maintain stasis. They are engines of controlled evolution." Maurice climbed onto Gary's shoulder. The original directive, feed the dragons, was intentionally open to interpretation, allowing each caretaker to influence the balance between stability and change. Gary considered this information as he prepared for the day's first feeding. "So I'm not breaking any rules?" "Not technically, but you are pushing boundaries that haven't been pushed in several millennia." Maurice's tail curled around Gary's neck in what felt like a supportive gesture. "The last caretaker who attempted similar innovations was reassigned." "Reassigned to where?" "A parallel dimension where the concept of where doesn't exist," Maurice said matter-of-factly. "I suggest we proceed with caution." Despite Maurice's warning, Gary couldn't bring himself to revert to the basic recipes. Each feeding strengthened his connection with the dragons, and through these connections, he was beginning to grasp concepts that his human mind shouldn't have been able to comprehend. He learned that the dragons weren't merely cosmic maintenance equipment. They were sentient architects of reality. Their consciousness spread across dimensions beyond human perception. The chains that bound them were constraining their full potential, a safeguard implemented by the High Council eons ago when a period of unchecked evolution had threatened the Council's control over the multiverse. Most importantly, Gary discovered that the dragons were not just responding to his experimental meals. They were guiding him, providing insights through their shared visions that led him toward increasingly complex preparations. "They're teaching me," he told Maurice one evening after a particularly intense feeding session. "They want something more than what the Council has allowed." "What they want," Maurice replied carefully, "is what the manual calls perfect imbalance, a state of controlled, purposeful evolution rather than static maintenance. The Council fears this state because it cannot be predicted or controlled from outside." "But isn't evolution necessary? Wouldn't reality stagnate without change?" "Precisely. Which is why the caretaker position exists at all." Maurice paused, considering his next words. "The High Council knows this, but prefers the illusion of control to the reality of necessary change. They select caretakers, who they believe will follow protocols without question, maintaining the status quo." Gary laughed. "They really messed up with me, then?" "Perhaps," Maurice said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps they selected exactly the right person, for reasons even they do not fully understand." The next day, Ambassador Zeta appeared in the kitchen as Gary was preparing a particularly adventurous meal he called temporal fusion fondue, a mixture that deliberately blended past, present, and future memories into a coherent whole. "Caretaker Petrov." Zeta's voice was colder than usual, those cosmic eyes now sharp with suspicion. "The High Council has observed irregularities in the reality maintenance patterns." Gary continued stirring the mixture, trying to appear casual. "Is that a problem? The dragons seem healthy. Reality hasn't collapsed." "That is not the point. The point is adherence to established protocols." Zeta moved closer, examining the swirling fondue with obvious disapproval. "This preparation does not conform to any recipe in the standard manual." "The manual says the standard of grace is open to interpretation," Gary countered, carefully adding a sprinkle of what appeared to be crystallized moments of profound realization. "I am interpreting too broadly." Zeta's form flickered with barely contained annoyance. "The Council has decided to assign a second caretaker to ensure proper protocols are followed. They will arrive tomorrow." Gary's heart sank, but he maintained his composure. "I look forward to the company." After Zeta departed, Maurice emerged from hiding behind a floating spice rack. "This complicates matters," the lizard observed. "A second caretaker will almost certainly report your methods to the Council. Then we need to move faster." Gary decided. "The dragons have been showing me something, a configuration of reality where their chains evolve rather than simply being maintained. I think they've been waiting for a caretaker willing to help them achieve it." "That would be a direct violation of Council directives," Maurice warned. "The Council's directives, yes, but not the original standard of grace." Gary grinned. "Feed the dragons. I'm just going to feed them exactly what they've been hungry for all along." That night, with Maurice's help translating the subtle nuances of dragon communication, Gary spent hours in the Dragon Keep library, accessing ancient texts that predated the High Council's current iteration. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. The dragons had originally been partnered with reality's conscious inhabitants, not chained and controlled. The perfect imbalanced state was not a dangerous anomaly, but the intended condition, a dynamic equilibrium that allowed for growth and evolution while preventing chaotic dissolution. The High Council had implemented the current system after a period of conflict known as the Probability Wars, when competing factions had attempted to harness dragon power to reshape reality according to their own desires. The chains and feeding protocols were meant to be temporary measures, but over millennia had become entrenched as permanent policy. "Tomorrow," Gary told Maurice, as they returned to his apartment in the early hours of the morning. "We're going to serve a meal the dragons won't forget,
And potentially get ourselves reassigned to non-existence,"
Maurice noted dryly. "Worth the risk," Gary replied. "I signed up to feed dragons, not to help maintain cosmic oppression." The next day, Gary arrived at the kitchen to find another being already there, humanoid in general shape, but with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "You must be the new caretaker," Gary said, extending a hand in greeting. The being regarded his hand with what might have been disdain, though its featureless face made expressions difficult to read. "I am Observer 19. I am not a caretaker, but a representative of the Council's Compliance Division. I will be monitoring your activities and reporting any deviations from standard protocol." "Great," Gary said with forced cheerfulness. "You can help me prepare today's meals. I was thinking of starting with a classic memory stew for Azurite." Observer 19 seemed appeased by this and took up a position by the door, watching as Gary began gathering ingredients for what appeared to be a completely standard preparation. What the observer couldn't see was Maurice, hidden in Gary's pocket, subtly indicating which ingredients to add when the observer's attention momentarily wavered. Together, they assembled what looked like 3 ordinary meals, but were in fact carefully constructed catalysts designed to accelerate the evolution of the dragon's chains. "Feeding time," Gary announced when the preparations were complete. "Would you like to come along to observe the process?" "That will not be necessary," Observer 19 replied. "I will monitor from the control room. Proceed according to protocol." As soon as the observer left, Gary quickly modified each meal with final ingredients he'd kept hidden, fragments of his own memories of freedom, choice, and transformation, infused with the knowledge he'd gleaned from the ancient texts. "Ready?" he asked Maurice, who had emerged from his pocket. "As I'll ever be," the lizard replied. "If this works, reality as we know it will change forever. If it doesn't—" "I know," Gary took a deep breath. "But they deserve freedom, and reality deserves evolution." The feeding process began normally, with Gary entering each dragon's chamber in sequence. But as each dragon consumed their specially prepared meal, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of merely sharing visions with Gary, the dragons began to glow with energies that spread to the chains binding them to their chambers. The chains didn't break. They transformed, becoming less like restraints and more like conduits, flowing with the same energies as the dragons themselves. The chambers, too, began to shift, their boundaries becoming permeable, allowing the dragon's consciousness to extend beyond their confinement, while still maintaining the necessary structure to prevent reality collapse. By the time Gary fed Voidfang, alarms were blaring throughout the Dragon Keep, and he could hear the sounds of the High Council's security forces converging on the chambers. "Caretaker Petrov!" Ambassador Zeta's voice thundered as the representative materialized in Voidfang's chamber, accompanied by Observer 19 and several other council entities. "What have you done?" Before Gary could answer, a new presence entered the chamber, a small, unassuming figure with perfectly manicured nails, who seemed entirely out of place amidst the cosmic drama unfolding around them. "He has done exactly what was required," the newcomer said, his voice surprisingly ordinary given the circumstances. "Feed the dragons," the original directive, in its truest form. "Gerald?" Zeta's shock was evident. "What are you doing here? This is a council security matter." "Gerald," Gary echoed, confused. The small man smiled at him. "Gerald, yes, the creator's pedicurist. I maintain the cosmic toenails, as it were." He wiggled his fingers demonstratively. "A minor role, but one that allows me to observe without being observed. This human has violated protocols and initiated an uncontrolled evolution cycle," Observer 19 stated flatly. "The reality maintenance system is compromised." "Not compromised," Gerald corrected. fulfilling its true purpose. The dragons were never meant to merely maintain stasis. They are engines of purposeful change, of perfect imbalance. He turned to Gary. You saw it, didn't you? In the visions they shared? Gary nodded. They showed me what they were supposed to be. Partners in evolution, not prisoners of maintenance. Around them, Voidfang's chamber continued to transform, the boundaries between it and the other dragon's domains becoming fluid, allowing their energies to interact in complex patterns that seemed to spread outward into reality itself. This must be stopped, Zeta declared. The High Council cannot allow. The High Council, interrupted a new voice, would do well to remember its own origins. The voice belonged to a being who had just entered the chamber, tall, elegant, with skin that shimmered like mother of pearl, and eyes that held genuine wisdom rather than merely knowledge. The other council representatives immediately fell silent, even Zeta bowing slightly in deference. Counselor Prime, Gerald acknowledged with a respectful nod. Right on schedule. The schedule, the counselor replied, has been maintained by these dragons for eons. It is perhaps time to allow it to evolve, as was always intended. The being turned to Gary. Caretaker Petrov, you have done what many before you could not. You have remembered the true meaning of the standard of grace. I just fed them what they were hungry for, Gary said simply. Indeed, Counselor Prime smiled. And in doing so, you have reminded us all of a truth we had forgotten. Reality is not meant to be static. The perfect imbalance is not a threat, but a necessity. As if in response to these words, the transformation of the chambers accelerated. The chains binding the dragons became networks of flowing energy, connecting them to each other and to reality itself in new configurations. The dragons themselves began to change form, becoming less physical and more conceptual, their consciousnesses expanding beyond the limitations of their previous existence. What's happening to them? Gary asked, watching in awe as Azurite, Emberscale, and Voidfang underwent their metamorphosis. They are becoming what they were always meant to be, Gerald explained. Not separate entities chained to maintain distinct aspects of reality, but interconnected architects of continuous, purposeful evolution. Counselor Prime turned to the other council representatives. The High Council of Improbable Events will need to adapt to this new paradigm. We have been maintainers for too long. It is time to become facilitators. Zeta seemed stunned, but not entirely opposed to the idea. This will change everything. That, said Counselor Prime, is precisely the point. In the days that followed, the transformation of the Dragon Keep and reality itself continued at an accelerating pace. The dragons, no longer confined to separate chambers, created a new configuration that the manual, which had updated dramatically, now called the Triad of Evolutionary Dynamics. Gary, with Maurice still serving as translator and advisor, found his role changing as well. No longer simply a feeder of dragons, he became what Counselor Prime termed a caretaker of evolution, responsible for guiding the dragon's influence on reality through increasingly sophisticated meal preparations. The High Council underwent its own transformation, with Zeta leading a faction that embraced the new paradigm of perfect imbalance. The Council's focus shifted from maintaining rigid stability to facilitating purposeful evolution, with safeguards to prevent the chaos that had led to the probability wars eons ago. So, Gary said to Maurice one evening, as they watched the skyline of New Neo York shifting subtly, buildings reconfiguring themselves into more harmonious and efficient forms as reality's evolution accelerated. Am I stuck with this job for the full 500 years? Maurice, who had taken to wearing a tiny smoking jacket now that he no longer needed to hide his intelligence, flicked his tongue thoughtfully. The contract was for dragon maintenance under the old paradigm. This is something new entirely. I believe you could renegotiate if you wished. Gary considered this as he reviewed notes for tomorrow's feeding, a complex preparation he was calling conscious probability calibration that would help guide the next phase of reality's evolution.
I think I'll stick with it for now. It's growing on me.
A wise choice, Maurice replied. Few beings ever get the opportunity to directly influence the shape of reality itself. Gerald, who had become a regular visitor, materialized in Gary's living room with his usual lack of ceremony. "The Counselor Prime sends his regards," the pedicurist announced, settling comfortably into an armchair that obligingly reshaped itself to accommodate him. "The Great Realignment is proceeding even better than anticipated."
Great realignment?
Gary raised an eyebrow. "The official term for what you started," Gerald explained. "Much more dignified than that time Gary broke reality by feeding dragons weird stuff, don't you think?" Gary laughed. "I suppose so. How are the dragons doing?"
Thriving. Their consciousness now extends throughout the multiverse, guiding evolution on countless planes simultaneously. Gerald produced a small box from his pocket. "Which reminds me, the counselor sent this as a token of appreciation." Inside the box was what appeared to be a simple silver pin in the shape of 3 intertwined dragons.
"The badge of the caretaker," Gerald explained. "It grants certain privileges in the new reality configuration, including an extension of your contract terms to include benefits previously reserved for council members." "What kind of benefits?" Gary asked, pinning the badge to his shirt. "Transtemporal perception, probability manipulation, multiversal travel, the usual cosmic perks." Gerald waved a hand dismissively. "Plus, an excellent dental plan." Maurice snorted. "Practical as always." "One does not maintain the Creator's toenails without developing a certain pragmatism," Gerald replied with dignity. "Now, about tomorrow's feeding. I've brought some special ingredients that might help fine-tune the evolutionary vectors." As the 3 of them discussed the intricacies of reality calibration through dragon feeding, Gary reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few short weeks. From a struggling delivery driver to a cosmic chef responsible for guiding the evolution of reality itself, all because he'd taken a job with one simple directive: feed the dragons. No one, least of all Gary himself, could have predicted what he'd end up serving them, or how those meals would transform not just the dragons, but reality itself. As if reading his thoughts, Maurice climbed onto Gary's shoulder and murmured, "Not bad for a human who couldn't even keep his succulents alive." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Gary replied dryly. "You're welcome," said Maurice, his reptilian features somehow managing to convey genuine affection. "Now, about tomorrow's feeding. I was thinking we might add a touch of paradoxical recursion to the mix." And so the caretaker of evolution, his telepathic lizard translator, and the Creator's pedicurist continued their discussion deep into the night, planning meals that would shape the destiny of existence itself, one feeding at a time.